Hello, hello, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rural, y'all. I am your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and today I am delighted to be chatting with Tim Lockette, author of Whippoorwill Award-winning book, Tell It True. To know more about that, check out my previous videos in this series, and you can also check out the Whippoorwill site, which will be linked in the description below. Tim is a former newspaper reporter who writes books for kids and young adults. He lives in Jacksonville, Alabama, the town where he grew up, after years of wandering to lots of other places, including Oklahoma, Florida, and China. He's a visiting instructor at Jacksonville State University, where he teaches English composition to freshmen, and his two books include Whippoorwill Award-winning Tell It True and Addie at Law, which landed as a Bookaroo Best Alabama Kids Book. So welcome, Tim, and I am so excited to talk with you today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really love what you do on this site and or on this project that you have. So it's just great to be here.
Thanks. I love sharing it with people and I love having these conversations. So I'm super excited and I love to tell it true. So I'm really looking forward to talking about all of those things. But my first question is one that I'm obsessed with and I ask everyone that comes on the show. So would you please tell us a little bit about your background? You talk about in your bio that you are from Jacksonville, Alabama. So could you talk about how being from there has impacted your connections to the rural and who you are as a person and an author?
Well, usually, I did say in my bio, I'm from Jacksonville. Locally, I tend to tell people I'm from Angel, which is a community outside of town. Sometimes people kind of chuckle about that because I think they see it as a place that is a former place, basically. But my mother's maiden name is Angel, so this is where the whole family is from, and or at least that her side of the family. I grew up out in that rural area. This is about 5 miles outside of Jacksonville. Jacksonville is a town of about 14,000 people, I think. Hard to count population in a college town, but that's what the Census Bureau said. So grew up out there. Because nothing is simple, I can't say I'm a native Alabamian. I can't say I'm a native rural person because I was born in the suburbs of Atlanta.
Okay.
My parents, like so many small town people, they moved to the big city for a while to try and get ahead in the world. So I don't really remember living in College Park or anything like that, which is where we lived, but that because we moved back when I was about 3. And I spent a year of my life in Kentucky, where my dad for a while was a Baptist minister.
Okay.
And he went to the seminary in Louisville. And he actually preached at a number of little churches, but he was the pastor at a little church in a place called Perry Park, which felt very remote. And whenever I think of Alabama as being rural, I think of Kentucky, and I'm like, well, that felt even more so, much more so. It wasn't all that far from Louisville, I don't think, but it felt like we were away from everything. Mm-hmm. But I mean, for the most part, I'm just a wild Alabama kid. I mean, I grew up just kind of out doing, it was the 70s and the 80s. There weren't regulations on what people do. So my kids just go out and get in trouble. So that was what we did. And that's how I grew up. I don't really think about rurality when I'm writing. I just am writing, yeah, you're right what you know. And I've had people comment about, this is somebody who writes about small town Alabama, but that just happens to be. I suppose I was a little conscious of writing about small town Alabama with my first book because there is, of course, it is kind of a loving parody or a response to Kill a Mockingbird. You kind of have to do that if you're from small town Alabama. Everybody's thinking about that, so let's just get it out of the way, and then. But for the most part, I'm not really. I'm just writing about things that I know and the kind of situations that I see around me. So.
And I read in one of your recent blog posts, you wrote about how you don't really set out to dispel stereotypes of rurality in your writing. You, like you were just explaining, you simply write what you know, and you desire as, to tell it true, or to give an authentic representation of the South that is neither idyllic or hellish. Is there value, I suppose, in landing on either end of that spectrum, as representing South as idle or idle, or representing South as the hell, like sort of in the Gothic tradition. Like, what do you think those types of writings do, and why do you think for you landing on neither end of the spectrum is important, I guess, is sort of
This is what, yeah, this is why the idea of, I love the fact that y'all read my book and said, well, this is a great response to stereotypes about small towns or the Deep South or whatever. Or I think of myself as being more from the Appalachian South, because we're running the northern part of the state.
Yeah.
The problem with writing to respond to stereotypes, to me, is that you get caught up in what is the stereotype. You know, you people confront you and say, well, what is the stereotype? And you say, well, it's this. And it's like, well, where'd you get that? And you can't really put your finger on it. You know it exists, you know it's there, but you can't really you can't explain it to other people. And you kind of wind up reinforcing the stereotype as you respond to it or whatever. So rather than, I try not to think about stereotypes when I'm writing. I'm just writing what I see around me. And then, you know, when you're editing, you kind of think, oh yeah, people will actually be surprised at this. And you may like turn up the volume on a certain thing a little bit, because it's like, I mean, yeah, my characters so far are, you know, they're indoor rural. They're not outdoor rural, pretty much. They're very much on the internet all the time, which is kind of, especially during the pandemic, that's a thing that everybody's doing. And they're smart alecky, basically. And that's not what is certainly, that's not the thing we're supposed to do or be in small towns. But, you know, I know people there that I'm one of those people probably, and I see a lot of these folks. So yeah, I mean, I would like turn that up sometimes and recognize, oh, this may surprise people. But I don't know. Sometimes I think the things that are most surprising to people are things I never really even thought about. I mean,
and I think that's because when you're in it, I don't know, like as an insider or outsider, sometimes it's hard to know what other people think, or sometimes it's hard to know and think outside of your experience, right? So like there's that kernel of truth to stereotypes, right? And so when you're explaining where a stereotype comes from, like, well, it comes from the fact that there are people who exist like this in these places,
yeah,
but not everybody is that. So like, you know, trying to disrupt a stereotype is basically asking people to move past essentialization and see that like there is nuance and there is complexity. And I think that you show that like very, very well in your characters, especially with Lisa. And really, and her mom, like all of the characters in Tell It True are complex. There's not just one person who's like one thing, you know. And I think that's important. And I think that that's important to show within a rural space, because it's so easy to, especially with things like the Blue Collar Comedy Tour and like all of these Deliverance, all of these things that sort of like have been publicly disseminated just to give the news coverage of the last couple of election cycles. There are all of these sort of like national spaces, pop culture spaces where who rural people are, like that story gets told, but not by rural people. And so people are writing what they don't know. And so then thus the stereotype is sort of created, and the only way that we bring nuance and complexity to that is to do what you're doing, which is for rural people to use their own voices to tell their own stories. And there will always be, I think, some notions or some aspects and experiences that sort of speak to or reflect the stereotype because the stereotype exists for a reason. But then there also has to be the other side of that, where authentic experiences that aren't the stereotype are also reflected. And so I feel like the danger of setting out to purposefully dispel a stereotype is like resulting to a more didactic approach of writing a story, of like, let me teach you, let me teach you about this instead. Let me show you, a life lived in these spaces, which I feel like seems more like what you're doing.
Well, I think if you have a really specific stereotype that's really bothering you, and you have a story to tell, I get that, but whenever I've tried to do this and said, well, this is what people think of the South or whatever, and I'm going to change it, that's when I get caught up. And I also have this, I think, a journalistic approach where you go to your editor and you have a lead for a story and it says, so-and-so is the typical, grandma or something. And then your editor's like, well, what's the typical grandma? I mean, some people's grandmas were like in a war and stuff, and some people's grandmas are doing this or that, broke their knee jumping out of a plane. And like, who are you to say who the typical person? So whenever you try to dispel a stereotype specifically, that's always a problem. I suppose there's a stereotype of kids that they can't be activists in the way that the kids in my books are. And I know that I'm dispelling a stereotype there. I know kids that can really, really just hold their ground with you in an argument. And it's, as a grown-up, it can be a little annoying sometimes, really. But they're smart kids, and you can't say no to them because, especially when they're right, when they got you beat, But I guess that's maybe a stereotype a stereotype defying thing too. But it would be different if I said, I'm going to write and show that kids can go into a courtroom and argue with a lawyer or something. It's more about having fun with that idea.
Stories of ordinary living are also important. And so I think when we set out sometimes to dispel stereotypes or to write stories, I think we all feel that pull to like, oh, this has to be the hero's journey, or this has, whatever. But like, no, like, why does it have to be that? Why can't it just be about, a teenager who wants to be an activist, who is an activist, who is well aware of what's happening in the world and is hell-bent on reporting the news in a way that, speaks to her community members, because the news that they're normally getting is coming from people who don't even live in the community. Like, why? Like, she is extraordinary, but she's also ordinary too.
But I recognize what you're talking about here too, because I do like, I think of it as like a superhero problem almost. I've long had this theory about kid lit, especially that there's every hero is a superhero, or it seems like this is a very successful formula. Like Harry Potter has, he has magical powers, but what he really has is a school that just lets him get away with anything. Right. The Hardy Boys had, like, I don't know what happened to their mom, but their dad is like rich, and like if they want to fly to Hong Kong and find a missing chess piece or something, it's just like, oh, that's like a superpower. They're rich and free. And so like everybody has a superpower. And I have kind of recognized that the superpower, I'm writing these superpowered characters that they essentially have agency that they might not have been. Well, I think Lisa is doing something that someone her age could absolutely do. And with the kind of support she has from her dad mostly, but her mom really does support her. I think that's absolutely doable.
And I think to some degree, everyone does have a superpower of some kind, something that they are really good at. And like the thing about these characters that you've mentioned, and especially Lisa, is that they have support. They have encouragement, and they have support, and they have people who are willing to help them build on their strengths while learning to recognize their weaknesses and the challenges that they're going to face because of their attitude or whatever it is. They have the support. And so like as a teacher, I love too how much this took place in a school and in a classroom, and because I don't think that a lot of teen stories especially happen like mostly outside of school, which to me is like they spend so much of their time in school. Like, shouldn't that at least play a part? But anyway, like the support that she gets from her parents, from her teacher, even willing to go toe to toe multiple times with the principal, like that, I think, opens up space where students can really flex their muscles, whatever their superpower muscle is, doing that thing. Especially in a small town where you're likely not to have like, a theater department with a multi-million-dollar budget, or you're not going to have, it's just the resources that other places have are not going to exist in the same way in a small town. But that isn't to say that the town doesn't appreciate those things. Especially in this case, when it's like, this is the town newspaper. Like the school newspaper is the town's newspaper. And I think that this is happening more and more and more. And like our conversation, the way we started thinking about like how place influences, who people are and what they write and how they write. Like thinking about communities and how journalism is connected to those communities, and what happens when journalism is being done by people who don't live in those communities for people in the communities to consume. Like, I thought that was a really, really important idea, and something that I hadn't really thought about as much. The town I grew up in had one blinking stoplight. We had like 2 bars, one restaurant, one gas station, and like, one liquor store. Like, like there was no library, there's no community center. The school was the library, the school was the community center. People gave blood in the auditorium, and they voted in the auditorium, and they, like, and so just thinking about ways how communities can show up for each other, and especially in a journalistic way, was something that I never read before. And so I was really, really excited to read this story and to think about how much that matters.
I think, I probably should say a few words here for the Anderson Star, which is the newspaper that I worked at for, I guess, 11 years before I switched to become a teacher. And one reason I left was that I had this book coming out. It kind of takes a position on the death penalty. And it after my first book came out, it was becoming more and more difficult to be a journalist and also be a fiction writer, and to bridge the ethical situation there, especially given that, it's a very, local politics is like a knife fight, at these small levels. Like people are really, really, and if you're going to be the referee, you've got to be just clean as a whistle. So I decided it was time to move on. But for, 11 years I worked at the Star, and it's the paper I grew up with. And for journalism nerds, the Star has kind of a place of some renown, I guess, in that it was a small town paper in Alabama, a white-owned paper that had been against segregation, which was a difficult thing to do. And it wasn't sort of boldly woke like you would expect, maybe you like that, but it was there. And saying subtle things and not so subtle things back then was a hazardous thing to do. And it had a reputation after the civil rights movement of bringing in people from like the Ivy League and letting them sort of cut their teeth on writing. But it also, for those of us who grew up reading it, there was also the fact that there were a lot of local, really good writers, just very poetic people like Basil Penny, who would write local features. And so you have this combination of sort of the egghead stuff, here's what experts told us about the SALT Treaty or something in the 70s, let's say. And then you got a piece by Basil Penny, who just lives right down the road from me over here. And he's writing about people who hunt crows for a living, like farmers pay them to shoot crows. And it's all together in one package. And I just grew up believing that there's no reason why a small town wouldn't have a newspaper that anybody in the world could pick up and say, that's a good newspaper. And that was, that was a big thing for me as a writer, I think, a big thing for me as a citizen. And working there, I felt, I really honored when I got hired. So, I do think that it makes me feel sad when people talk about communities that don't have a newspaper, because just there's a very basic thing in the presence of a local newspaper. And one example I would give, other people have talked about this before, but the obituary as it used to exist. It used to be that when you started working at a newspaper, one of the first things you do, they would put you on the obits desk. You got a 4-year degree potentially, or you're almost there as an intern. But the first thing you do is you get a press release from a funeral home. You call people, you make sure everything's correct. You've studied like, Shakespearean drama or whatever, but you're writing, Thomas Franklin Lockett died Wednesday, age 72. And it's just very basic factual stuff. And there's like it is like a sonnet in a way, in that it's formal. There's, in a not bad way, there's like a kabuki element to it. It's the formalism where if you change just little things, it means a lot. And then you have maybe 2 sentences where you can let the family say, and he really loved gardening or something like that. That very, very tight form, it had a real dignity to it. And I felt like it mattered that everybody in the community got that. For a while, I worked at the Gainesville Sun in Gainesville, Florida, and there was a reporter there, Ron Matus, who did this brilliant story where he had found out a local homeless person had died, and he didn't know about it because there was no obit. And he went out and was like, well, why aren't there obits of homeless people? And it was because because the information comes from the funeral home.
Right.
And he did a whole story. He did an obit on a guy, and he did a whole story about how people's bodies are treated when they die and they're homeless. And it really bring a tear to your eye, but it also reminds you, it's not a privilege. It's a right. It's something everybody deserves, but you deserve to be memorialized in this way. Right. But if you don't have a local newspaper, that's just a basic kind of element of dignity that you get from having a local paper.
I think that it's important to think about. I think that there are a couple of things that really speak to me and really speak to the work that I do and what I care about in terms of local communities and how they support one another. My mom and dad both grew up in Tipton, Indiana. All of my family is essentially from there. I mean, they moved. My dad's family moved there from East Tennessee, but they've been there for a while. And so my papa recently passed away, and I attended the funeral via live stream because I couldn't go home. And his obit was online. You can find it online. But the first thing I did was print it off, so that I could put it in my little memorial box. But seeing the people who came to his funeral, he was a member of the Elks. They did their thing. The way that even that small, section of the paper brings communities together and lets them know what's going on in each other's life, I think is important. Every time I call home, especially to talk to my mama, there's always a report of everyone's health, like so and so, even if there are people that she thinks that I know that I actually don't really know. Like I know their names, but I don't really know how I'm related to them or how we know them. She does, and so there's this report like, everybody here's doing fine. So-and-so, has come down with the flu, or so-and-so had COVID, so-and-so's, husband passed away. I just talked to her yesterday and she was like, Dr. Mike, the community doctor who delivered me, and all of my other siblings, except for one, I think, his dad passed away, and she was telling me about that and how she was playing, like they just, and so I'm like, well, how's Mike holding up? And there's just that connection through that, I think, of supporting one another. And like, really, everyone acts like it's a bad thing that everybody knows everybody else and everybody knows everybody else's business in a small town. But I'm a firm believer that there's another side to that, and that if you know everybody else's business, you can really support each other in ways that you might not be able to if you didn't know everybody else's business. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing that really struck me as you were talking about working for the Star is that when those spaces exist where you can see rural people as writers, then rural people believe that they can be writers.
Absolutely.
When I was coming up, I firmly believe that the only way that you were ever going to be a published author is if you were from New York, LA, and Chicago. And I've said that in I don't know how many of these interviews, but the truth, it hasn't changed. That is what I believed. And so even though I loved reading and even though I loved writing, I didn't believe that I could be a writer. And also as a working class kid, you know, they tell you to get a real job. Like you want to make sure that you have some kind of income, Jay. Like being a writer is not a reliable income. So do something different, you know?
Oh yeah.
And so I think that's an important point, you know, and I think that Tell It True makes that point because Lisa can then see herself as a writer, an editor, an agent of change, and she learns a lot about how to write, about how to tell a story, through her interactions, not only with her teacher, but also the experiences that she has. I don't want to give anything away, but the experiences that she has in the book really teach her a lot about what it means to be a human being and how to tell a story about a human being, and a human being's experiences. And so I think even though it may have felt tangential, I think what you were talking about actually speaks a lot to why the Whippoorwill Committee really loved this book, why I really loved it, and why I think it's so important to get it into the hands of young readers. So speaking of writing and you know, I think we've kind of talked a little bit throughout this conversation about you know, you as a writer and decisions that you make as a writer, but I'm curious about your writing process, because as an English teacher and as a teacher of future English teachers, we talk a lot about, you know, writing pedagogy and process and what that looks like and how it can look different for different people. And so I'm hoping that if English teachers or teacher educators are watching this, that or, you know, any of these interviews that I do, they have a chance to sort of show that there's such a spectrum of, you know, why people became writers. So we can tackle that question too, if you want, and what writing process looks like for each of them. So if you want to talk about why you became a writer and what your writing routine or your writing process looks
yeah,
like.
absolutely. You know, I've been thinking a lot about recently why I write, because I've started to feel a little bit like, I don't want to, people who have, I don't want to take anything away from someone who has a certain specific, let's say like a disorder or something like that. I mean, I've been treated for depression in the past. I know there are all kinds of stereotypes associated with that. And people will say, oh, I'm depressed. It's like, well, you're not really sick necessarily. Sometimes they are. So I don't want to take anything away from anybody else on this, but I started to feel like writing is maybe akin to some kind of dissociative experience. Like when people have traumas sometimes, and it's very common for people to dissociate. They have like depersonalization and derealization. You have something terrible that happens to you, and when you remember it, you almost see it like you're looking from outside. Or and this is a thing that's happened to me, especially related to the subject of Tell It True, actually. I'll be sitting at a desk making a lesson plan, and I'm just like, how could I possibly be the same person that did that? You know what I mean? And that's like derealization or depersonalization. And sometimes I feel like this thing of this almost like a seizure of getting into a story about a completely different person. It feels like purgative. It feels cathartic. And I will get to feeling really bad emotionally. And if I have a good day of writing, which is like 2 hours of pretending to be a completely different person on the page and creating all these characters and creating a conversation with them, when that's done, I feel great. And I almost feel like it's a dissociative experience that, you know, like you just have to have. It's not like a disordered way of dealing with that, but it's a thing I've got to do.
Yeah, it's a way to process.
Yeah, the way to process
without taking it head on. You know, like it's like it's like lower risk processing, where you're not necessarily looking exactly at you, but you're sort of looking at you through like a, I don't know, like a fun house mirror or a window through curtains or something, you know?
Yes, and that's the same with the stereotype thing we were talking about before. It's so much easier to tell a story of somebody and say, well, here's this girl from the country, and she's got this accent, and people are seeing her on YouTube and they're responding to her accent. Well, that's not me whining about my issues. I know this is totally realistic. My readers know this is totally realistic. I'm not saying it happened to me, but we know that this weird situation is possible. And so in that way, you kind of get it out. You get the story out, or you get this thing out of your system. So I'm working on a fantasy novel right now, and it has nothing to do with any kind of thing that's going on like that. So, and it does feel purgative in that way sometimes. I don't know why. Maybe it's I don't have enough trauma in my life right now, and I'm happy with that. I'm happy to. I don't necessarily want to write something like Tell It True again if it means collecting the material for that book. So I've thought about writing a book about a tornado and watching your one of your recent interviews.
Barzak.
Yeah. Christopher Barzak's interview was interesting to me because I had an idea for a tornado survivor book, but I was just too close to the thing because we had a tornado that hit here about 4 years ago. And it was just, I mean, it's a difficult experience.
Yeah.
But I'm skipping that, or it's going to become some other thing.
Yeah.
In a book somewhere. But I really do think that's one reason why I write. And I don't know that it's a bad thing. No. Or life is traumatic for everybody. I don't see myself ever not needing to write fiction for that purpose. So that's just basically the why, I guess.
I identify with that a lot. Usually my writing process takes the form of poetry. And even if nobody's ever going to read it, even if it's never going to be published anywhere, I can't help it. It's almost a compulsion. Like, I end up composing in my head. Sometimes I come back and write it down, and sometimes it's just enough to have thought it in my brain. But my good friend Sarah J. Donovan she has a site called Ethical ELA, and she does an open write every month for English teachers, English teacher educators, where we write poetry, and then there's always some kind of prompt. But one of the assignments, yesterday's prompt. They're not assignments. Yesterday's prompt was an antonymic, what did she call it? Antonymic translation, where you take a poem that exists already, and then you change some of the words in it to their antonyms to change the meaning. So I've been thinking a lot about hope lately, and what that means, what it means to have hope, and what it means for people to be hopeful. And so I took Emily Dickinson's Hope is the Thing with Feathers, and I changed it. And I didn't realize how much I needed to change it until after I was done writing it, and it had gotten out of me. But the first stanza was, despair is the thing with talons that rips apart the soul and screams the words without the tune and never stops at all. I got done, and I just felt like I could exhale finally, and so I feel like that's what you're describing. Being able to use writing as a place to process what you're feeling without looking it in the eye until you're done with it, Yeah, I feel like that I totally identify with that a lot. I just feel like we don't teach like why to write, or how to find your why of writing, or that you have one and you may not know it. I taught at a rural school, and a lot of my students just really felt like they didn't need anything in my class. And I'm like, y'all, you can go out and plow your field and then come back home and write a poem, and it doesn't make you any less of a farmer. You can go into your welding apprenticeship and like to write stories about, like, I don't know, forest nymphs and fairies, and it doesn't make you any less of a welder. You like it. Writing and reading shouldn't be elitist things. even though that they've been used that way in the past. So you can go work on cars and come home and read Shakespeare, and that doesn't make you any less of a mechanic. So yeah, like I think I tried in my classroom to communicate exactly what we're talking about, like that people have reasons for reading and for being able to dissociate in that way, because I think that that's sort of an act of dissociation too, when you can identify with a character. And you know, everyone has those reasons, but everyone's reasons are different. And that's okay. You know, I just think that we don't take that up in the classroom as much as we should. I don't think. I've talked to a handful of authors who have talked about the importance of reading to writing, which I feel like English teachers do that too. But I'm just curious about like what you read in order to sort of feed yourself as a writer.
I'm sort of weird with this, and I don't know how to explain my reading taste right now exactly, because you would think that if I'm writing young adult lit, I'd be reading young adult lit, and I don't do it as much as I thought I would. I don't do it as much as I did when I started this. I don't do it as much as I did when my son was younger. Actually, this summer I've been reading a lot of works in translation. Is probably the best way to describe it. I've always been interested in like the thoughts of people from very different cultures than ours. And I'm always interested in when some writer is brought to me. Like I always enjoyed hearing who won the Nobel Prize this year, because it's always somebody I've never heard of.
Yeah.
It's not awards where the Oscars, it's like, well, I don't care about who won that because I've heard of all these movies. But, you know, when somebody wins, somebody from, I don't know, when JMG Leclésio wins the Nobel, I'm like, well, I'd never heard of this guy before. So I've discovered something. And that's what I've been reading. Leclésio this summer. Roberto Bolaño, who I'd never read before, but a colleague said, you should do this. And I'm like, I've been meaning to, so I did it. Annie Ernaux, who actually published, I guess she's a founding writer for the publishing company I publish with, but I'd not really been that familiar with her until recent years. Amazing memoir. I don't even like memoir that much, but this is, I don't know how to describe how good it is. And I realized that translation is, the translators are the people I should be, you know, expressing some excitement about. And I think some of this has to do with being in newspapers for a long time. And some of this has to do with being a science fiction reader as a kid. Clarity is really important to me. Style for the sake of style. You know, sometimes I read a book that is really stylistically brilliant. It usually makes me really depressed, actually, because it's like, how did they do that? And also when you're doing just style for the sake of style and you hit a sour note, it's like playing the organ in church, you know.
Yeah.
When they hit a bad note on the organ, it lasts a long time. So I like writing for clarity. I like writing to organize my own thoughts.
I think that there is something about reading something from a perspective outside of your own that is always going to keep you open to new things. And so will keep you open to the idea that like adolescents are people who sometimes make bad decisions, but sometimes make extraordinary differences in the lives of the people around them. And that kind of goes back to what you were talking about before about Lisa's agency and her activism, and how like adults make assumptions about what adolescents are capable of and what they should be able to do, and what, you know, like if they're riddled with hormones and aren't capable of a critical thought. And young people are socially and culturally constructed differently across places. So you know, like in the country you start driving when you're 10, whereas like, you know, like even that small difference, and sort of like the responsibilities that were leveled on me as a young person growing up in the country are different than the responsibilities that are sometimes leveled on young people who are growing up in a city, right? Like, and then there are differences about like what we believe that youth are capable of across nations, and so I think that the idea that there is, yes, there are biological things that happen to young people, but there are also biological things that happen to adults. Like, we are never fully formed. It's not like we just arrive into adulthood and we're just like, okay, this is us now, and we're never going to make another mistake, and we're never going to question who we are as people, and we're never going to do any of that because we're out of adolescence. Like, that doesn't make any sense, but that's the
Right.
story we tell. And so I think like reading stories from perspectives and ideologies and viewpoints outside of our own culture, to me, would help you be open to considering, that what we think about a lot of different things, including young people, may not be exactly right or like good, or whatever. I took a Nobel winning laureates class at Purdue University with Dorothy Deering, and I didn't look at the syllabus before I took it. I didn't really, or the description. I just love taking literature classes. I didn't really care what we were going to be reading. I was just excited that we were going to be reading, And when we got in there and I looked at the syllabus, I realized that like the purpose of this class was to read people outside of the US, So we read like Snow by Orhan Pamuk, and
Love this book. Love this book.
so good.
Yeah. I went to Turkey when I was in the military, and actually we were in a town where it snowed one day, and it hadn't snowed there for like 43 years. And when I go back and I read this book, I'm like, that's so bizarre that it wasn't deep snow like it sort of was in that book. But sorry, I didn't mean to get off on that.
No.
Love the book.
Yeah, and it's a book I would have never picked up probably if I hadn't took that class. But we read Seamus Heaney. We read gosh, there were so many. Oh, Nadine Gordimer.
Yeah.
But we read a lot of people that I don't think I would have ever read had I not taken that class. And I learned to think about things differently because I was reading from other perspectives. And I think the same thing like with movies. I often look for foreign films to watch because I feel like they deal with they're not superhero movies usually.
Yeah.
And they deal with the world and thinking about the world in a lot different ways than what the film that gets produced in the US from this culture looks like. So I totally understand I why you would want to do that, and I think that it has to affect the way that you approach what you write, even if you can't name it right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, so a few things that strike me as we are talking. One is that when we're thinking about like, foreign film works in translation, that kind of stuff, like the assumption is that rural people wouldn't be into those things.
Yeah.
The second thing is sort of the way that we have talked about literature and reading and sort of knowledge of our writing process and that kind of stuff. The assumption is that rural people don't do those kind of things.
I mean, there's public television. You can watch, an opera by Puccini, and it's not really, there's a reason why they call Star Wars space opera. It's like really simple and giant emotions, right? Inside little people. And that's basically what, Puccini is. Mm-hmm. They have subtitles at the bottom of the screen. You can read it. It's not, I really do think there are a lot of rural people who are into high culture or whatever you want to call it, because they want to be entertained. Mm-hmm. They have curiosity about the world. Mm-hmm. That's how public television that's how libraries have stayed in business, I guess. And yeah, absolutely. People want to, it is a weird thing. And I sometimes wonder if it's not so much a bias from outside, but a bias from inside. Country music is where country is represented. And like, I don't know why we always have to set up this sort of paradigm of like, you're drinking wine and going to the ballet and you're just this terrible person, or else you're wearing boots and, you got friends in the low places or whatever. Why can't, the way we really live is more integrated than that. So why not when I was a kid, we were in band, we have a Christmas concert, which you always have. And we played the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah.
Yep.
And the band director turns to the group and tells everybody, okay, so the tradition is when this is played, everybody stands up. And it's because the King of England heard it, and he stood up. And so everybody stood up. And so that's the way we always do it. And, that's kind of hoity-toity fancy stuff. But after you've heard that, you know that. So, you can't unknow it. I can't become unsophisticated. And, I guess having grown up in an Army town, that's a big part of this of Calhoun County, is that we had an Army base. It's much less populated, Anniston is at least, than it used to be. But we always had people coming through who are, working class folks. Most people in the Army are enlisted, but they've seen the world. They've been to Germany. They've been to Korea. That's the place everybody had been. I was really surprised when I joined the military and I spent maybe 4 hours in Korea, never went to Germany. But,
my great uncle was stationed in Germany.
Say what?
My great uncle served in Germany.
There you go. And they, they learn things. You see, I've heard so many things about Germany. I'd love to see it. Never been there. But you become, you learn about the world. You can't you can't reverse that process. And why should you feel, compelled to?
Right.
Why not?
I think that's a really interesting way to think about like the ways that we negotiate space and place, especially from a military perspective, because a lot of my family served in the military. As Steve Earle once saying, they draft white trash first around here anyway, right? Like they went into the military so that they could use the GI Bill, so that they could, or so that they could make money to send home. And so, like thinking about the way that class and place intersect, especially within the military, is really interesting. And it's something that I haven't thought about before. And I'm going to be thinking about that more now. But yeah, I think the idea of what culture is, like I talk to so many people who don't think about rural as culture, and I absolutely think about it that way. But I feel like in small towns, culture is always outside other, whether it's outside of your class position or your racial identity or your ethnic identity or your gendered identity or whatever, right? Like culture was always something outside. It was never what was inside. And so I feel like a lot of this work that I'm doing is trying to show that that's an inaccurate way to think about it or look at it. My hillbilly identifying relatives read all the time. One of my grandpa's most prized possession was a collection of poetry that he read over and over and over again. But that's not the story that gets told, right? And so again, coming back to that sort of insider outsider perspective and how that works in publishing and how important it is for rural folks to be telling rural stories. I think that this is part of it, right? That rural people do enjoy these things. They watch foreign films. They drink wine. They enjoy the ballet, they also might like bluegrass, as I do. Yeah. I love bluegrass.
Yeah.
And Americana. You can like
both.
What's that?
You can like both.
Yes, you can like it all.
Yeah.
And so so that factor of identity is really fascinating to me. How we make sure that people see us as who we want to be regarded as means that we have to show and hide things based on dominant cultural narratives. And so the fact that we've had this entire conversation as an authentic experience between two rural people, without necessarily, I mean, it is kind of my mission to dispel stereotypes, but like, I don't think either one of us went into this conversation of like, oh, we need to talk about these things so that we make
Right.
sure that we dispel rural. We're just having an authentic conversation about the things that we enjoy and the things that we enjoy dispel rural stereotypes, because that's just not the story that gets told. And so that's sort of like a meta thing that I hadn't even really, that's a metacognitive thing that I hadn't even considered until we started having this conversation, which is why I love talking to people.
I've really enjoyed watching the other interviews in this series too, because it made me think about a lot of things that, related to rurality. That, like I said, I don't think about rurality that much because I'm here in,
Right.
I mean, I'm not really rural because I live in town. I mean, I live on the edge of a town of 14,000 people. But I realize it's different than, I lived in Montgomery at some point. I lived in Gainesville, Florida, and which is kind of urban. And, I mean, it was, but yeah, this is different. Sure.
There's a there's a spectrum of rural, right? Because rural doesn't necessarily mean remote. I think remote always equals rural, but rural doesn't always equal remote.
That's it. Yeah.
And rural doesn't always mean agrarian. Even though a lot of people think about it that way, it doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, there are rural people like, I don't know if you watched Pedro Hoffmeister's, but he grew up in the Sonoran Desert. And so like there's desert rural, there's frontier rural, and not all, there's island rural, and those things might not be agriculturally based. Appalachian rural, a lot of that is connected to, mining and extraction communities that way. So like that's what I love about this too, that I've talked to so many different people from so many different places who identify as rural or not in so many different ways, that like there's just such a rich, it's creating this tapestry, right? I feel like.
Well, it's good that we're addressing rural teachers, because now I think about it, you're talking about there being non-agricultural rural. Look at a small county and look at their listing of like the big employers. The school system is always the biggest employer in the county. So, I mean, that's part of what we see in rural communities is educating people is actually a big industry in small towns.
Oh, like that's why consolidation is such an issue, because if your community school dies, your town dies.
Like school is probably where people go vote.
Yeah.
And if you're having an assembly of some sort, if you're not in town, then that's where the community gets its name. We have communities here that in Calhoun County, Alabama, that were named after a school. When the school goes away, the concept of the community goes away. I mean, like it's no longer, we don't really think of this place as Roy Webb, because the Roy Webb school isn't here anymore. Right. So yeah. Oh, totally.
Yeah. And I just think that that's something that not everyone understands, because they haven't experienced it. All we know is what we know, right? All we know is what we can know from our own experience until we experience something different. And so and that can be through story, and that can be through conversation. And so that's another reason why I do this, because I hope that it's helpful in that way for folks.
I'm enjoying it, but I'm not a K-12 teacher, but I'm still enjoying it.
Well, I mean, it still counts. It still counts.
We'll have to edit things down, because I know I ramble and go in weird directions.
Oh.
You do that probably.
That is my favorite way to converse. That is my absolute favorite way to converse, because you never know what you're going to discover. Like, just follow the conversation, even if it doesn't, that's one of the reasons why, like, I hate formally structured interviews. Like, I always go with the semi-structured. Like, these are some things that I think would be good to talk about. We'll start with like the first question, then we'll see where the conversation goes, because you never know what you're going to discover. If you be like, well, that's not really what we're here to talk about, so can we please and
maybe rurality has some point in that, and some role in that too, because the ways people interact. I mean, when I go and talk to, I can't name names of relatives or friends because I don't want to, but you go and talk to certain people and you're there way longer than you wanted to be, because conversation is not we're not talking air traffic control here. We're,
Right.
You get around to who all your cousins are and everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that roundabout way of talking, maybe that's just, we're acculturated for that. I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. I actually wrote one of my blog posts is about my rural language variety and rural language practice, because it's not really seen outside of Appalachia, at least. It's not really talked about as a language variety or language practice. But in my conversations with my dissertation participants, I noticed that we would all, even though I had one person from Tuscaloosa, I had one person from South Carolina, I had Central Texas, West Texas. I'm obviously, I call myself Appalachian infused Hoosier.
Yeah.
Huh?
That makes sense. That makes total
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. So we just have these, so like cooperative overlapping, which I feel like we've done some in this conversation, which is hard on Zoom, but like, paying attention so much that you like try to finish the other person's sentences or provide a word you think that they're searching for. I do that all the time. So
I
yeah.
wasn't doing that now, but I just interrupted you talking about interrupting.
To me, we are building conversation together.
Really?
And this is how I was socialized. This is how I came up to understanding how folks communicate with one another. We never took turns. Everybody was always talking all at once, and we could all keep track of what everybody was saying. Like that's just how it is.
Yeah.
And so
how do you know when they're done talking?
Right.
How do you know when it's finished?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not finished. Like, because the conversation can always be ongoing as long as both people are willing to continue to build it. So like the only time you ever really know if it's over is if somebody, like, in the Midwest, we make a joke about like you kind of tap your legs 2 times and then you say, well, guess it's about that time, like that's the only way if somebody's gonna leave your house. And then even after that, there's likely still to be a conversation on the way to the door.
Yeah.
And that still lasts for like another 15 minutes or so before you actually leave. And like, that's not rude. That's, considerate where I'm from. But in other places that is considered rude. And I didn't know all of these things until I actually got out of where I was from. And so yeah, I think that the way that we converse and sort of how we learn to follow conversation and the idea that we can just let it go where it goes is definitely something that exists in rural cultures. So if you're willing to spend the time with somebody, that shows how much you respect and honor and recognize their importance, right?
Makes sense. Yeah.
And if you like, it's not an interruption to, it's a way to show that like I am paying so much attention to you that I am so on the same page that you're on that I can suggest a word or finish what you're going to say. And if I say a wrong word or I don't finish what you're going to say in the same way that you were gonna, then we sort of figure out why that was and how we were on different pages, and then we can come and be on the same page. But if that interaction doesn't happen and all we do is just kind of listen silently to one another, then like how do you make sure that the person that you're talking to has listened and understood in a way that you were hoping that they would listen and understand?
I totally get it. But it is difficult because it's like it annoys a lot of people, clearly.
I know.
But it's not the way I'm an interrupter, sadly, and I'm working on it really hard.
I think that there's something to be said for talking to whoever that you are talking to about how you want to communicate with one another.
Yes.
And if someone says like, it really bothers me and it throws me off track and I have a hard time thinking when folks interrupt me, then it is the considerate thing to do for a cooperative overlapper to sort of step back and say, okay, then I'm going to do my best. But at the same time, like that person is compromising because it helps me to think, to be able to speak as the other person is speaking, because I think through speech. So then how do you decide who has to give up their ability to think their best, right? And I think a lot of times it's the cooperative overlapper, because that is not the dominant, privileged way of conversing with one another.
I hadn't thought about it that way. Wow.
Right. It's part of the assumptions that we make about people based on the way that they talk and the way that they talk with us and the way that they converse with other people. Like, we have this idea of what it looks like and what it means to effectively communicate with somebody else. And it's always metrocentric. It's always urban normative. It always privileges a middle class, suburban, usually white way of speaking with other people. And so, I tick the box on one of those things, but I came up in a working class family in a rural area. And so, like, the way of communicating that feels the most intuitive to me and helps me think the best, if it's not the one that's most accepted by the power structure, then what does that, mean about how the opportunity that I'm given to make meaning and communicate with other people, like, again and again and again and again,
And you also have the problem of you're producing content here that somebody else is going to watch. And do you meet their expectations of how the flow of the conversation is going to go, or do you challenge their expectations? And that's always a hard one too, I think.
And I think that it's really difficult for me, because if I have to monitor whether or not I'm interrupting, or if I have to sort of police my way of communicating with other people, then that takes brain power away from me thinking about the questions that I want to ask and the things that the people are saying that I want to come back to. And so I find that in these conversations, especially, it's hard for me to be anybody other than I am. Lyle Lovett has a great song where he says, "I'd change my ways if I knew how else to be." And that's exactly how I feel. Like, I'd change my ways if I knew how else to be, but this is the only person I know how to be. And so like, I just communicate the way that I would communicate. And if folks don't like it, then I guess they don't have to watch my, they don't have to watch it. I don't know what to tell people, like, this is just who I am.
I don't know. I like this a lot, this flow, personally, but
I do too. And because most of the folks that I talk to are rural people, I found that they also enjoy it, because it's just that it's a cultural connection that we have. It just happens naturally too. Most of the time, I don't think we even think about it or end up talking about it. But I do, now that I know to look for it, I do notice it, that it happens on both ends. And it's not just me, but it's the other person reciprocating. Like as an interviewer, the person recognizes that I welcome that sort of interaction because I engage in that sort of interaction. And then it's like, it's just our natural way of communicating throughout the interview, but anyway.
And if we have this back and forth and we're just sort of, knocking on the door of culture and, asking, hey, pay attention to us, somebody could look at it and say, well, this is just a mess. But if it's like Oprah talking to Prince Harry or something, or it's like David Letterman interviewing Kanye and it gets all unruly like this, then people are like, oh, well, yeah, that's lively. So what do you do? I mean, I guess the difference is they can pay somebody else to do the editing and you got to do the editing all by yourself. So good luck.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely lovely. I'm looking forward to future work. So I haven't read Adiet Law yet. That's on the top of my TBR list. And I'll be looking out for other stuff from you. Congratulations again on your Whippoorwill. And
thank you in multiple levels.
Sure. And I just really appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been delightful. And I'll find a way to get to interact with you later.
I have a feeling that our paths will continue to cross, and I'm happy about it.
Okay. Thank you so much.